Henschke, of course, we all know as an iconic Australian wine producer. So we're privileged in two respects to have Prue here today. Let me hand over to her so she can tell us all about old vines in Australia.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, it's quite an exciting project that began in 2009. I think the first idea arose about doing an old vine charter, perhaps stimulated by Yalumba in the first place. And we thought about it, and I guess we wanted to reflect the history. So, because every phase of the sort of development of the Barossa represented a particular time in history. And I think the vines reflect that. So I thought I'd start off with the old vine charter, just to give you an idea of what we have in our vineyards. Certainly at Hill of Grace, we've got the grandfathers, which we think were planted in 1860. That's the first reference to that vineyard. So it could well be older. Those vines are perhaps the most vigorous in Hill of Grace vineyard because of that site selection next to the creek. So it's in a well-watered spot. And so the longevity has obviously come from that site selection. And then we have another part of the vineyard that was implanted in 1910. And the vineyard rows are actually quite interestingly narrow. Everything was worked by horse in those days. And I guess it was only when the tractor came on the scene that the vineyard rows actually expanded to about 3.6 metres. So Mount Eddleston is planted on a grid of 3.6 metres apart in the row and between the rows. So a very different planting system. So yeah, we've got the various stages of Shiraz in our vineyards, which is wonderful. I mean, it's just a wonderful heritage to have and to look after. So, and I've done a lot of amazing things with these old vines, putting them up on Scott Henry trellis, for example, to try and help out with the vigor. I guess the idea of trying to expose the bunches to more light and especially the canopy, so you get better more mature tannins. So that's sort of where we started. So if we flick through, you can see the two different parts of the Barossa Valley, or the Barossa Valley, which is the lower lying section there. And then if you look at the profile of the mountain, or the hills, it only goes up to 500 metres. Eden Valley sits on top of that range. So very different rainfall, temperature zone, and also lighter soils in most places. The Hill of Grace is actually on a red-brown earth, which is more like the Barossa Valley. But it's an interesting difference, but both areas have old vines. So it was really those early settlers who took up land allotments that were released by George Fife Angus, and that's where they settled. So if we flick through to the next slide. So here we are, we've got some actual details about the hectarage of the vines. So over 100 hectares within the Barossa, and it's not only Shiraz. So there's, interestingly, the Cabernet Sauvignon mentioned there is the old Penfolds vineyard. And there are quite a few Grenache and Mataro vineyards, but also Riesling and Semillon. So it spread across those varieties that the original settlers were planting. As you can see, yeah, low tonnage, although they can bear well. It depends on how you prune them. But definitely that deep root system is part of the function of an old vine. And just in summary there, the biggest difference we found was that the old vine fruit does have this more intense, complex, better tannins in the balance of the palate. So that in itself makes it interesting. I'd ignore the photo on the right there. That is a virused vine. Our old vines are luckily very free of virus. The most amount of virus we'd have would be in the Grenache, and that's really rare. So yes, old vines don't look like that right-hand photo at all. I don't know where that came from. Okay, let's have a look at the old vine charter. Just to flick through to the next slide. I think there's a bit of timber in the next slide. Yeah, that just gives you an idea of the layers and layers of bark. The vine is really unusual because it's a plant that is a vine, but it develops wood. So it's got layers and layers of bark. And in that way, it gives it longevity. So you can actually survive over hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, here's the old vine charter. So old vine, I guess it's really about that fully mature root system and trunk structure that differentiates it from a young vine of about 10 to 12 years old. The survivor vine, now these are particularly interesting because they've survived a lot of the difficulties of not having the vignerons around. So World War I, most of them were away and the vineyards were basically abandoned, and that's why you see it so much of a twisted shape, because those vines were left unpruned. The Depression, really, those vineyards that were only producing survived. A lot of vineyards were actually grubbed out during the Depression or abandoned. The centenarians, they're perhaps going back into the 1800s. So they're the representatives of the traditional values. So definitely in very specifically selected sites, like next to creek lines, next to some sort of moisture source, and always dry grown. And then the ancestor vine was really planted by those early European settlers. So they were the sort of the pioneers who had to clear the land and then establish the vineyards with pre-phylloxera material. So that was actually what we call the Busby collection, and perhaps that's why it was restricted to those main varieties that were listed before. So I guess each category, although it represents a timeline, it also represents a social expression, the social history expression of the period. So that was, I guess the charter is voluntary. We don't require any certification like South Africa, but I guess people use it in their marketing to promote the fact that they've got old vines in that particular wine. Hill of Grace is actually a mixture of old vines, and I think the average age is about 80 to 90 years. Then after that, we decided, well, what is the distinguishing marks of old vines or wines from old vines? So the Barons of the Barossa have a foundation where they raise money for projects, and this was a specific project to find out what distinguished old vines from young vines. So we brought in the Adelaide Uni people. Cass Collins was the leading lecturer there, and we set up a trial or project, and it was just fortunate in the Barossa, many of these old vineyards have a neighbouring young vineyard, because obviously as the old vineyards created more financial gain, the vignerons then decided, oh yes, we'll expand. We'll go and plant a vineyard next door with the cuttings from those old vines. So we had perfect setup for the trial. There were 5 vineyards looked at right across the Barossa and Eden Valley, and Hill of Grace was in that collection as well. So they actually looked at a lot of measurements, I guess the regular maturity data, vegetative performance. So they were measuring trunk diameter, and this was ended up being particularly relevant because it's so different, an old vine to a young vine. They looked at wine chemistry, berry characteristics, and finally wine sensory. So I guess out of those trials, it showed that vines aged more than 49, 50 years old showed more similarities with the older vines, whereas the younger vines, the 6 to 28 year old vines, were definitely classed as young. So there's something magical about that 30, 35-year-old vine when it changes over. The grapes were actually picked at the same sugar levels, and this actually showed that something that we'd always talked about was the pH tartaric acid balance. So in the older vines, it was always a low pH, higher acidity feature in the maturity data, and it certainly held out in the trial. The older vines showed lower anthocyanins, so lower colour, but the tannins were more complex. I guess the sensory characteristics were more intense flavour, aroma, and mouthfeel. So this is something we couldn't really measure by chemistry. It was really had to be done by a sensory panel. So a bit more red fruited too, so that, yeah, they were able to, and I was part of the panel. It was very easy to distinguish that the old vine from the young vine, particularly when you were comparing the same vineyard. So that was, it more or less authenticated what the winemakers were saying. A really interesting aspect of the study. So that's now, that was done in 2016, and that's available on the Wine Australia website if anybody wants to read the whole trial project with a write-up for the project. So yes, it's been a wonderful trip to look at all these beautiful old vines, and I think now the proof is in the pudding. At the moment, I guess the prices per tonne for Shiraz has always been fairly high, $5,000 to $8,000 a tonne, and Grenache is just taking off as well. I think it's just rising over $5,000 a tonne. So it's worthwhile hanging on to your old vines. Yeah, it's really an interesting change, social change for the Barossa. And I'm just hoping that, you know, other countries can see the value in it too, because it really leads to that better quality in the structure of the wine. So I guess that's perhaps what I wanted to talk about. I know I've got a bit short of 35 minutes, but if we open up the discussion, I'm sure there'll be a lot more interesting topics that will come out of people's questions. Shall we go to the...
Yeah, thank you very much, Prue. Yes, we'll open up the floor to any questions from anybody here. Either unmute yourself or just put something in the chat.
Can I ask Prue a question?
Yes,
please?
go ahead, Jane.
Hi, Prue. Very good to see you.
Yes, good to see you too.
I hope you're having an easier time of it than we are in lockdown in London. We're getting very tiresome here, coming up to a whole 12 months of this, but wine is our saviour and joy, as we know. I'm interested in your comments about what old vines have in terms of sensory perception. And you mentioned the word red fruited, which I've not heard anybody mention in connection with old vines before. And I wondered if you could expand on that for us a bit.
Yes, I think that's most probably related to the lower colour figures, the lower anthocyanins.
Okay.
So yeah, it may be because the old vines are bigger, maybe they're just more vigorous, and that might be a reflection of the red fruited character. But yeah, it's just there. But it could be because the vines are bigger and
So that
have
there's some kind of dilution of flavour there. Is that what you're
a
emphasising?
little bit. Yeah, I think dilution, and also
because when you think of Barossa Shiraz, you think of, forest fruits, dark colours, a great wallop of flavour. So you're saying this is,
and I think maybe related to the trellis structure too, because in Mount Edelston, when we changed from the sprawling canopy, which most of them are sprawling canopies, we changed over to Scott Henry, we saw a real increase in anthocyanins. So that may be related to the trellis structure too, because of that shading effect.
yeah, thank you.
We have a question. Thank you, Jane. We have a question from Wink. Wink, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Okay. Hello, Prue.
Hello.
Thanks for that. I just wondered whether you and your colleagues in Barossa had much sort of communication with those in California who are also working to preserve old vines in areas like the Sierras and Sonoma, in parts where they didn't get the second wave of phylloxera.
No, we worked totally alone. I guess it was the stimulus came from Yalumba because of their old vine research. And it really was sitting down and working out the classifications that we chose. And there was some heated discussion, but it was really settled when we could look at the social impacts of the day. So really significant that you can split up those early settlers. They were really choosing those sites to the best of their knowledge. And I think actually I've got great admiration for the 19th century vignerons, because they seem to have more horticultural knowledge than we do. They were just very good at their craft. So it was that, the early settlers. Then I guess there was a big argument about centenarians, but we felt it would reward a lot more vineyards that were 100 years old. And I mean, that is a real marketing tool, over 100 years old. So that's when it was post-Federation drought. So 1907 was a particularly dry period. So anything that was planted after then was seriously, good quality. Then the survivors. This was easy to choose because those vines had to survive some pretty severe happenings across the world. So when you look at a lot of these old vineyards, they're really contorted and twisted because the trellis basically fell over. And most of the Shiraz wasn't bush vines, it was actually trellised. Grenache and Mataro are good candidates for bush vines, but I don't know whether anybody's seen the vines that Cirillo do. It's actually a nest of the canes woven into each other to form the nest, and that was the only way they could control that really sappy, lanky growth of Shiraz. So that was very easy to choose, the survivor, because of those periods of neglect and abandonment. And yeah, so, and then I guess then you go down to the old vines. I mean, it's obvious that changeover is about the 30-year mark from observation. And I guess the winemakers have been working with these vineyards for so long. I guess it was really the young Turks coming in the 80s and starting to see the value of the old vineyards that helped that trigger.
Okay, we've got a question from Christine Austin. Christine?
Hi, Prue. Bearing in mind South Africa has gone down the route of certification for age, is there any point in Australia also doing that? Because if consumers get interested in the whole prospect of old vines, how do they know what proportion of old vine juice is actually in a wine? How do they know it's genuine? Just really, how do they rely on the fact that these are old vine wines?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I guess it's really about being honest about it. I mean, surely the marketing of an old vineyard includes a photo or two, and also often during the Vintage Festival we have an old vine tour, so people were able to go and see the actual old vine sites from a lot of the top wines. But yes, there's always the risk of somebody calling old vines older than 10. But yeah, they get held down a bit, I think, if they do the wrong thing.
But what about blending? How much proportion of the old vine juice needs to be in a wine for it to be old vine?
Well, I again think that's totally up to the honesty of the winemaker. And why would you? Why would you put young Shiraz in with old Shiraz when the old Shiraz tastes so much better? So,
okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Okay, Stefano, you have a question for Prue?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yes, I was just wondering, how old can vines become before they become useless, or do they ever become useless? I guess, 1,000-year-old vine may exist, but does it produce useful fruit?
It all depends on the pruner. So I guess the one threat that we are struggling to manage is a trunk disease called Utipa, or there's a variation of this in Europe called Esca, and that is a limiting factor. So if the pruner isn't astute, then the vine will die within, say, 10, 15 years. What we've done at Hill of Grace is we've pruned always to the young wood, so we're constantly refreshing the crown with new canes. We never spur prune old vines. Well, Grenache we would, but we have to renew the cordons regularly. But definitely with the grandfathers at Hill of Grace, they cane pruned. And I don't know whether you've heard of a technique called Simonette and Search. It's called sometimes soft pruning, but it's about always bringing the healthy conducting tissue, always bringing it from underneath. So you never make a cut, a large cut on the underneath side of the vine. It's always on the top. In that way, you're going to always get your conducting tissue growing without any hindrance or any cone, what they call cones of death, that would limit the growth of the vine. So it's very important to put your best pruners in your oldest vine patch. So I think the vine at Hampton Court is over 300 years old, isn't it? It was planted in.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, so there must be a good pruner there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano. And over to Keith. Keith Granger's got a question regarding vine balance. Keith?
Hey, Prue. Can you discuss vine balance with regard to old vines? There's a lot of talk about them achieving a natural balance and that you don't need to do summer pruning, etc. Then I've probably got a supplementary after you answer that one.
All right. Yes, you always have to do, and that's part of the soft pruning, the Simonet and search method. You always have to look after the structure of the vine in spring, early spring. So you've always got to disbud things growing in the wrong spot. You may have left a single bud spur to finish that wood off when you've changed direction. So you've just got to flick off the new bud, and that will die. That would die off, not so much into the wood, but will die flush with the bark. So all these little techniques are really important. But yeah, you do have to do shoot thinning.
Thank you. And so leading on from that, there's also a lot of discussion that one of the reasons that old vines yield such superb fruit is because they're naturally low yielding. Now, I'm not sure if you read this horrible book by Mark Matthews, Professor of Viticulture at University of California, Davis, who claims that all this is just a myth, you know, and that you can get the very best of fruit from relatively young vines, and that low yields don't lead to better fruit. And in fact, he even tries to dismiss the whole concept of terroir. Do you want to comment?
Yes, well, I think certainly at Mount Edelstone, we can get 15 kilos per vine if we don't thin. We can get triple buds bursting, you can get water shoots bursting and bearing fruit. So yeah, you can easily get an enormous yield on an old vine. It's simply about the health of the wood that the pruners have left in place. I guess if a vine is struggling with Utipa or Esker, that will reduce the yield simply because the wood's not healthy. It's a sort of factor of health more than this sort of mysterious thing that old means low yield. So I agree with you.
Just the final one there. Do you think old vines give a better expression of terroir?
This is really interesting because the young lad who was doing the work on the Old Vines project actually looked at epigenetics in these vines and he found differences. He then took the cuttings off the old vines, expecting that genetic expression to carry over, and it didn't. So this almost says, well, maybe those old vines are expressing what they experience through the seasons, through the soil, the water balance of each season. So I think there is an adjustment by that vine to that site. And certainly the wines from each of the sites that we looked at were very different in different flavor profiles, different tannins, and perhaps in the intensity of color too. So yeah, it was a really interesting feature, and I think that epigenetics needs to be looked at a bit more.
Thank you, Keith. One question that's come through is do old Shiraz vines behave differently to old Riesling vines? And are there big differences between the varieties?
Yes, they are, because Riesling's a bit weaker. It doesn't have quite the node length. If you look at a Shiraz vine, the nodes are quite long. Riesling's quite tight, and yeah, an old Riesling vine looks much smaller. It doesn't have those beautiful swirls. It's more chunky, chunked up on each other. But that's more expression of its internodal length, the way it grows.
But there's no reason why one should last longer than the other, or
no, only if Utipa comes in. So I think there is a varietal susceptibility to Utipa. So Semillon is the least sensitive, and Shiraz and Riesling perhaps the most.
No, is that possible? Yes. We'll do anything.
very Okay, one question from Noah. Noah, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, g'day. How are you, Prue? Yeah, I've got a question in regards to the global warming. I mean, it's definitely a topic that we hear quite often. Yeah, I mean, especially here in Australia, there is more conversations about cool climate areas. For example, I'm located in Beechworth. There's a lot of conversation around Tassie as well. But I was just wondering how you guys expressing or experience basically the effects of global warming. Do you find bud bears become earlier? Do you find the picking dates to become earlier as well? Any more leaf covers on the vine to protect the fruit from sun, etc.?
What we're finding is that extreme weather events are more extreme. So I think the timing, the phenological timing is really a difficult one, because we've looked at a lot of data from the 70s right through to now, and it seems as though Shiraz is always picked at Easter. Now, Easter shifts by 4 weeks from the earliest to the latest, and Shiraz follows that. So what is ruling the phases of the moon, I don't know, but there's some system in that harvest moon that sets up anything, I guess, any crop to mature according to the season it's experiencing. We're not seeing any change. We're seeing that change mainly in relation to that, but not so much from climate change. I think for us, it's more frost, so clearer nights. Certainly the rainfall patterns have changed, and I think they sort of come together. So that those clearer nights, rainfall patterns changing. So we're getting less of the even rainfall. We're getting more downpours and thunderstorms. So it's really, it's hard to answer, but I think there is a slight creep in the background temperature. So it may not go up drastically, but it is slowly creeping up. We know that the underlying temperature has gone up by 1 degree, for sure.
And with saying that, just to add to that, so do you find the need basically to use more regenerative agriculture in the land, sort of like planting more or plowing more? Do you find any need to help the soil to basically retain moisture a bit more, or?
Yes, so we've got a system that when we came into the 90s and we're seeing all these weather patterns changing, we knew we had to do something to help preserve the moisture in the dry-grown vineyards. So we added a blanket of straw mulch, and that really, really helped. So we're able to retain more moisture in the soil past the end of December. And then I decided to add compost under the straw, and that's really helped too. So in that way, we've been able to preserve more soil moisture, and we've actually cooled down the exposure of the earth, the dry earth, to the summer temperatures. So that's been very useful. I think that technique is now pretty widespread. So plus we're starting to have to pay $50 a bale for wheat straw, which is kind of expensive. But yeah, so, and we're looking at different ways of doing that soil coverage, so that we absolutely do not cultivate at all, because as soon as you cultivate, you lose that beautiful layer of organic matter and your microbes. You kill off everything. So it's more about covering and using perhaps clovers under vine, so that they die off early and they form a blanket during the summer. So we're looking at a lot of those aspects now. It's quite interesting to see how many research projects are actually gearing up, and they're certainly going towards regenerative agriculture. So we're actually starting to talk to our farmer friends about this whole new version of looking after the soil.
It's funny how changes in the winery could take sometimes seconds, where changes in the vineyard could take sometimes years.
Yeah, decades. Yes, exactly. So yeah, I've been looking at the organic carbon levels in the soil, so organic carbon percentage, and it's risen from under 1 to just over 3 in 8 years. So I started measuring in 2005. No, it's 7 years. Maths is bad. But anyway, yeah, it's a slow change.
Okay, thank you, Noah. Renee, would you like to put your question back?
Yes, for sure. Hello, Prue. Renee Langdal from Denmark. I was wondering about modern selected clones. Do you think that these selected clones usually are selected to safeguard against virus infection, for example, and propagation and the vine homogenization in vineyards and vines in general has an effect on the ability for the vines to get really old?
Yes. I guess in Australia they've done a lot of selection work, mainly on yield. So in the 40s to the 50s, there was a concerted effort to go into the old vineyards and actually select out material, and then it was actually assessed for its virus status and also for its yield. So a lot of those old selections, and I think that and I'll call it a selection, 1654 has actually a huge shoulder, so it's almost like a double bunch, and it is a high yielder. So I think everybody's aware of the fact that we need to mix up those selections, because there's different yields, different flavor profiles, certainly from the selections that I've seen, and they come from different areas. So, for example, Hill of Grace must have come from a slightly different area to Mount Eddleston, because you can see the leaf shape is slightly different. So I think, and the flavor profiles are slightly different. It's a bit hard to separate it because they're in different soil types, but certainly you can distinguish a Mount Eddleston Shiraz from a Hill of Grace Shiraz. The virus, virus is my enemy number one. I don't like virus. It's as insidious as Utipa, and we don't need it. Plus, a lot of the pre-phylloxera vines are actually very, very low titer of virus, if any. We might see leaf roll 4 or 9, but nothing greater. We don't see a lot of virus in those old vines, and they were ungrafted. So a lot of those viruses came through grafting onto rootstocks. So yes, we're only just starting to see the build-up of leaf roll 3 happening in the vineyards now due to poor selections and the prevalence of vectors. So scale and mealybug are perhaps not as well controlled. I guess comes with a bit of irrigation too. You're always looking for luxurious growth in the canopy, and that may stimulate some of these vectors to actually carry those viruses into the younger vineyards.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. As there aren't can't see any more questions coming through. Another one is obviously, are you getting ready for all set for vintage?
Yes, we crushed some Riesling this morning. That's perhaps our first little foray into vintage, but next week, yes, it'll be Riesling full on. And the acids are so immense. We're actually waiting for the acids to drop. So we're getting sort of, I think the fruit that came in today was 7 to 8 grams per litre. So that's beautiful, really well balanced.
It's looking good. Otherwise.
Yes, yeah. The yields aren't that, they're a little bit lower than average, but that doesn't matter. Loose bunches. So we had some wicked weather during flowering, so and frosts. So that's really perhaps sort of pulled down on the size of the bunch and the set as well.
The frosts have been the main reason for that, or?
A little bit, but also cold, windy weather right at flowering too. That always disturbs that.
I think also Winnie Bowman, one of our committee members, says today that Andre Morgenthau from South Africa is here, who's also involved in the Old Vine project there. And I don't know if you've met before.
No.
Andre, did you just want to say hello?
To everybody, and thanks for having me. Very interesting so far.
Great. Oh, good. Yes, we were in your country 3 years ago, having a look at a few old vines as we drove through.
Yeah, I was at Henschke in '99.
At the.
I visited you in '99.
Oh right. Okay.
So you have met, maybe not.
But Andre, can you just elaborate a little bit on some of the legislation and stuff that we have here? Because for me, what's always very important is that the neck label. Hi, Prue. By the way, you can see I'm also from Cape Town. Table Mountain in my background.
I climbed a mountain.
Andre, just specifically maybe about the neck label and the seal of the year of the vineyards, because that I think makes a huge difference in selling the wines. And also, if you can just say something perhaps about rehabilitation of the vineyards that we've got in South Africa.
Okay, so to speak to your first comment on the legislation, we have a system in South Africa, an industry organization called SARVIS. They look after statistics and registration of and regulations on labels, along with or the etiquettes and the information on with the Wine and Spirit Association. So, but what's unique about SARVIS is their planting records dates back to 1900. And this is something that no other region, to my knowledge, has. We started the Old Vine project in 2016. I've traveled overseas for this purpose to visit other regions, but I had the privilege at the last Prue Vine to, at very low cost, and maybe just energy of walking from one country to another, to meet with my so-called counterparts. And I met with the Australians and South Americans, Europeans, and discussed firstly the 35-year and older mark. And it seems to be an agreement that vineyards they're becoming balanced, as you said earlier, between 30 and 40 years. So there's an agreement on that. And then, but the planting records don't exist with other countries. So that means we can actually have that certification seal that Winnie mentioned now, with the actual planting date, the year on that seal, which then communicates to the consumer traceability, quality, and provenance.
Yes, we have a registration of vineyards, but it's more for biosecurity. So in that is the planting date, if the grower knows it. So that's held in under confidentiality, so I don't think we could use it, but it's certainly there for South Australia. So our state's free of phylloxera, so everybody has to register their vineyard on the Vine Health Australia registration site, and but I don't think we could use it for verification of the old vine wines.
Yeah, that's what I gathered by talking to everyone, that there's anecdotal proof, or it's written up in a diary, or the grandfather says it was planted in that year. But what we have is an actual legislation that's governed by the Department of Agriculture in South Africa, and as I said, dates back to 1900. So some of our vineyards are older than that, but we only have the dates from 1900 onwards, which which makes it unique in that way. I find your viticultural discussion very interesting earlier. I totally agree with what you said about the mulching, the soft pruning. I always liken the old vines as an old age home. You know, it's not like teenagers that you just treat the same. You know, this young vines, there's a method of pruning. Old vine pruning is more like sculpting. You've got to look at each vine separately, individually, and as I mentioned, as in the old age home, each room is different. Each person there is different, and you have to pay a lot of respect. And one of our members, Johan Kruger, always says, when you work with old vines, it's like talking to your grandmother. You should rather listen, not say too much.
Cute.
You listen to the wisdom.
Yeah, well, they certainly show. I guess it's that reaction to disease that they can avoid by being healthy, and that really is the choice of the pruner, to make sure that he or she doesn't make that nasty cut, which will interfere with that that vascular flow.
Yeah, that's indeed true. We run pruning courses specifically focused on old vine pruning, that's sponsored by Falco, the pruning shears. And Falco sponsors us every year, and our members get the benefit of that specific, very detailed pruning courses and training.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah. In fact, one of the Simonette and Search people, what was her name, was from South Africa. So she was in Australia for a good while, helping train growers to prune their old vine or young vines. Really, it's so important, because you've got to start that respect for the vascular system from a young vine, right from the first time you make a sniff into it.
Yeah, that's definitely true. We, as we went along through the years since 2016, I realized that it's not only about the old vines. It's exactly what you said now, and I coined the term "plant to grow old." We encourage our members to plant to grow old, meaning certified virus-free material on the correct rootstock and correct site, and then that vine can grow not on a 20-year cycle that's currently like in South Africa because of our bad material historically. You can actually plant that vineyard and it could grow gracefully old until 68 to 100 years.
Yeah.
Prue, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Just going back, I was interested by what you said about the flavour profiles of Hill of Grace and Mount Eddleston. So going back to your home patch of dirt, could you just expand on what you feel those differences are and possibly why?
Yes. Well, Hill of Grace has this what we call kitchen spice, so more anise, a little bit of cumin more than cardamom, but yeah, those lovely Middle Eastern spices, really quite exotic, yeah. And I think, yeah, it depends on the block. They've all got different tannins, but Mount Eddleston is certainly more sage and pepper.
Yeah.
Since we put them up on Scott Henry, we have got a patch at Mount Eddleston that's actually on an umbrella trellis, as I call it, just a sprawling trellis, and it's chalk and cheese. The flavour profile is more that gentle red fruited flavouring. It's sort of like a soft plum and a lot lighter in colour.
Yeah. And have you got any clue as to the clonal differences between the two? Or is that lost in the midst of time? I'm going to go for the latter option myself.
We know Mount Eddleston came from a selection from Joseph Gilbert, who was working, and that actually came from James Busby. So those were all those very early selections of Shiraz Syrah that James Busby did in Europe. It's a really interesting story. I think Andrew Kayard certainly got a lot of the stories behind the journeys that they made across to Europe. Yes, quite fascinating. There's a couple of attempts to actually get the material back to Australia.
Gosh. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jane. There's just a question from Christine and Wink regarding COVID or how it's affecting the harvest.
Well, we're actually okay. South Australia hasn't got any cases at all at the moment. Victoria, I think, has just got another case. So there is a restriction on anybody living in the Greater Melbourne area, and that's about all. I think that there was, I mean, they ran the tennis without any problems, except for a few tennis players who escaped quarantine. But yeah, the tennis program's gone really well. There's been no problems there. And yeah, we're basically, I guess what we do is we still have the app. So everywhere we go, we QR code in. And so there's a registration of where everybody's been. We're social distancing. But yeah, everything's fairly normal.
Aren't you lucky?
Yes.
Quite. I'm with you there, Christine. It's all getting very tedious in London.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
You don't want to rub it in, Prue, or make you feel small and tiny, but you just like to put it out there.
Yeah. But it could turn the tables anytime, you know, somebody could turn up. I guess the big threat is the flights coming in. So the returning Australians who are flying in, often there's been a quarantine for 12, 14 days, and then afterwards they test positive. So yeah, there's little escapist accidents like that. And then it's always the Medi hotels. It seems a lot of the security staff are catching it, and then even though they're not supposed to have a second job, it gets it contaminates their second work site, and off it goes. So yeah, there's a bit of a problem around the Medi hotels for quarantine.
Yeah, so we're all looking forward to brighter times, I think, everywhere, really. I think we've almost taken up enough of your time, Prue. So I'm not sure if anybody else has got a quick question while we still have Prue here. Otherwise, I will hand over to Liz Saggies to thank everybody for the morning.
Thank you very much indeed, Prue. That's been absolutely fascinating. And what's been great is that we've had such an opportunity to ask questions and have a debate about it, because too often that it's sort of, we run out of time towards the end, but this has been excellent with so much discussion. So thank you for giving up your time, especially in such a busy moment with the harvest happening. And thank you also to Emma and her colleagues at Wine Australia for putting forward the idea and organising it for us, of which we're really grateful. And thank you ever so much, everyone. For the next session, just to remind people, we're going to a quite different part of the world, to Uruguay. So that will be on March the 5th, but we'll send full information to everybody shortly. Prue, thank you again. Good luck with the harvest. Good luck with no more COVID cases in your part of the world, and hope we will be able to travel and see you on the spot at some point. Thank you very much.